Muslims are not being persecuted in Gaza. What they call radicalization, just simply by means of the Quran, by means of this man reading it in his room and then deciding to carry out what it said. And nobody wants to face the implications of that possibility. Islam, as it is traditionally formulated, contains teachings that are political and supremacist.
How significant is the Islamist threat to the United States?
Oh, well, it's extraordinarily significant. It could ultimately be a matter of life and death. But because it's not of immediate urgency, most people don't realize that it's even happening.
Is Islam compatible with Western values?
Many Muslims can live in the West with no problem. However, Islam, as it is traditionally formulated, contains teachings that are political and supremacist and completely contradictory to the values enshrined in the U.S. Constitution.
Can you talk a bit about how Muslims in America have integrated into the United States compared to those Muslims in Western Europe?
In Western Europe, the Muslims formed communities that grew into enclaves, particularly in France, but also in other countries, where Islamic law was enforced at the expense of the law of the land. These enclaves have only grown, and the conflict between them and the larger society has grown more acute and will continue to do so. In America, that has not happened for the most part. There is a growing community in Dearborn, Michigan, another one that is far less on the radar in New Jersey, northern New Jersey, and there are a few elsewhere. But for the most part, Muslims in the United States, in the first place, are a much smaller population than they are in the countries of Western Europe. But also, they have not settled in these particular areas and asserted Islamic law there to the degree that that has happened in Europe. That could happen in the future. There have already been signs of it. Even about 10 years ago, there was a notorious incident in which some Christian evangelists were arrested in Dearborn for preaching to Arab Muslims, even though, of course, that's not against the law in the United States. It's only against Islamic law. But they were quickly released. Nonetheless, it was a disquieting foretaste, I think, of what is likely to come should this mass migration continue, as well as a general disinclination to acknowledge that there are even any problematic aspects of Islamic law at all.
So historically, immigration to the US has been driven, certainly in recent years, by Hispanic, Latin American countries. You know, a large majority of these people coming into the US have been from those places, you know, where they have a bit of a Catholic tint, maybe they're more secular, I don't know. Can you just assess how many Muslims have entered the US, and you know, is that sort of rapidly increasing, the numbers?
Well, the numbers are certainly rapidly increasing, but there's no way to give you an exact figure at this point. With 8 or 9 million illegals in the country now, because the Biden administration essentially erased the southern border, it's impossible to tell. But we do know that there are Islamic entities that have noticed this and have taken advantage of it, because there has been a large number of people on the terror watch list who were apprehended at the border. And the problem is that for everyone who's apprehended, there's likely another or more who got through without being caught. So there's an unknowable number of criminals, an unknowable number of jihadis in the United States already, and more coming in all the time.
So we saw recently some members of ISIS being arrested in the United States. What about this issue of dawah? Can you talk a bit about dawah and how Islam is spreading in the US?
Dawah is another big problem that is completely unnoticed on the part of government, law enforcement, and intelligence officials. But you take, for example, quite recently, there was a case of a young man who converted to Islam in Las Vegas, 16 years old, and he entered into an elaborate plot to carry out jihad terror attacks in the Las Vegas area that would have been mass casualty attacks if he'd even been able to carry off one of them. And this was yet another in a long string of converts to Islam who have been caught plotting jihad massacres. And yet, even though this is a steadily recurring phenomenon, we had another young man from Maine not long ago come down to Times Square on New Year's Eve and try to slit the throats of police officers. We had converts to Islam doing this on a more or less regular basis, and yet nowhere in the world, not just in the United States, but nowhere in the world is there anyone in government or law enforcement or intelligence who is studying the phenomenon of conversion to Islam and trying to figure out how this kind of radicalization among converts can be prevented or what causes it. Because of this dogma that Islam is a religion of peace that is unexamined and yet unquestionable among our various authorities, these kinds of questions can't even be asked.
But of course, most Muslims are peaceful. Is there a danger that we're overgeneralizing here? We're taking the actions of a minority and we're applying it to everyone?
No, we are talking about the actions of a minority, there's no doubt. The problem is that the majority that is peaceful doesn't do anything, and I don't think it can do anything to stop those who are not. And the distinction between the two is often exceedingly fine. For example, there are numerous people who have been secular Muslims, who have been drinking, who have been doing other things that are against Islam, and then they have a religious awakening, and they decide that they're going to stop wasting their life on debauchery and try to serve God. And by their lights, that means they end up reading the Quran, studying it, and committing jihad attacks. I think the most notorious example of this was a young man named Mohammad Reza Tahiri Azhar from Iran, who was in North Carolina, at the University of North Carolina in 2006. And he was behaving like a typical college student until he had this kind of religious awakening, started to read the Quran and study it very closely, until finally he rented an SUV and drove it onto campus trying to kill as many students as possible. He injured 9 students. He didn't kill anyone. But then he wrote a series of detailed letters to the campus newspaper explaining with copious quotations from the Quran why he had done what he had done. And so this is something that no authority ever wants to acknowledge, that this was what they call radicalization just simply by means of the Quran, by means of this man reading it in his room and then deciding to carry out what it said. And nobody wants to face the implications of that possibility.
I know that you and others have been criticized, heavily by many parts of the left and the media as being so-called Islamophobic. And they say that you take parts of the Quran selectively and that you, apply a very strict definition or literal definition as to parts of the Quran. What do you say to this, accusation that you're somehow Islamophobic or that you're selectively taking passages and so on?
Well, of course, the charge of Islamophobia is ridiculous on numerous grounds, one of the most important being the fact that it's a made-up word with no legitimacy. Islamophobia as a concept nobody had ever heard of until 20 or 30 years ago. The term was invented in order to intimidate people into thinking that it's wrong to oppose jihad violence and Sharia oppression of women and other groups. And so that is how it is used against people like me, but it doesn't have any substance. And I think that it was interesting to note that the Labour government in the UK recently acknowledged this tacitly when it was challenged. The Secretary of State, I forget the Secretary of State for what, but in any case in Parliament, she was asked, can you define this Islamophobia that you're about to criminalize? And she sidestepped the question and offered no definition and just said they were working on it. And the reason why she can't define it is because it is a deliberately elastic term that conflates vigilante attacks against innocent Muslims, which are never justified, with genuine criticism of Islamic teaching in the ways that it can incite to violence, which is necessary, or else we're always going to have this violence. And the two are put together so as to silence the criticism under the guise of stopping the vigilante attacks, when actually the two have nothing to do with one another. Now, as far as taking the Quran out of context and so on, I've written a commentary on the entire Quran with a new translation of the text. There is no part of the Quran I have not examined and discussed in print. And so it's kind of ridiculous to say that I'm ignoring elements of the Quran. I've examined the Quran probably more than any of the alleged journalists who claim that I'm picking out pieces of it that are violent. But the problem is not actually how I read the Quran at all. The problem is how Islamic jihadis read the Quran. And they are the ones who are picking out violent passages and acting upon them. And the whole world pretends it's not happening and pretends that Islam is really peaceful and they're somehow misunderstanding it. And yet we don't see any pushback against their understanding of the Quran among Muslims who disagree with them.
This is an incredibly controversial topic to talk about. I recently made a film in Dearborn in Michigan, where you mentioned, which is America's only Muslim majority city that I know of. Maybe in New Jersey there's another one, I don't know. But I was interviewing these imams, and some of whom have said some very radical comments online. And I felt personally as a journalist, slightly scared, because I spoke with Ayan Hirsi Ali, who, she's had her own experiences of being threatened. Her life was threatened by talking about this stuff. Have you experienced any personal threats or concerns about talking about this issue? I don't know, how have you kind of got past this controversy?
I get death threats pretty much every day, and they tried to kill me twice, but they've failed so far. In 2015, Pamela Geller and I sponsored a Muhammad art exhibit and cartoon contest in Garland, Texas. The idea was to defend the freedom of speech against violent intimidation. But two jihadis from Phoenix drove 8 hours to Garland, Texas in order to murder us. They were stopped by our security team, and when they drew their guns, they shot one of our guys. They didn't kill him, but then they were killed in turn. And then in 2017, after I spoke in Iceland, I was poisoned by a young man who came up to me in a restaurant. And so they've tried twice, but they have not killed me yet. It may happen at some point. I think if we don't have people who are willing to take the ultimate risk in order to tell truths that are unpopular, then our defeat is already sealed. And so as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't make any difference to me. It's not as if I'm going to live forever if I don't do this.
Well, you've also been banned from the United Kingdom, as far as I'm aware. Do you know why you were banned? Are you still banned? What's going on there?
As far as I know, I'm still banned, but I haven't tried to go. In 2013, I was about to go when I received a letter from the Home Office that said that because I had said that Islam has a doctrine of violence against unbelievers, I would not be allowed to enter the country. As far as I know, that's still in effect, but as I say, I haven't tested it. It was sort of silly, on the other hand, because Islam does have a doctrine of violence against unbelievers. This is readily provable and easily established. And so it was as if the UK Home Office was saying to me, because you say water is wet, we are not allowing you into the country.
I want to bring it back to America. You talked about Dearborn, this city in Detroit. What happens when Muslims, in your view, kind of congregate and become the majority in cities in America? How does that impact the locals there who've been living there for generations?
Well, look at Dearborn and Hamtramck. These were areas that were Polish and Irish and so on, as immigration to America was dominated by various demographics in the past. And then it became an Arab area, first an Arab Christian area, and then Muslims moved in. And now I believe that it is Dearborn, is it Dearborn or Hamtramck, that has an all-Muslim city council. It's one of the two, and a Muslim mayor. And so it's interesting to note that in the first place you have Muslim candidates in that city, whichever city it was. I'm sorry, I don't remember.
It's Hamtramck, yeah.
It's Hamtramck, there you go. And they appeal to the wider population on the basis of diversity. But diversity means diversity, that not everyone is the same. And so if everyone on the city council is a Muslim, that's not actually very diverse at all. But they don't talk about diversity anymore. Now they are setting out to implement Islamic provisions. And of course, in the United States, this is much less farther along as an initiative than it is in various areas of Europe. But you already had I believe it was the mayor of Dearborn, who is also a Muslim, say that there would be I'm sorry, my memory is faulty on this, but I believe, actually, on second thought, I think this was in Hamtramck. They said that during one of the gay pride months, there's so many now, but during one of them, they told them you can't fly the gay pride flag on city property. Now, I have no interest in flying the gay pride flag, but I think that it's interesting to note that the left helps the Muslims get into power, but then when the Muslims get into power, they don't return the favor. And they don't uphold this wonderful diversity. Rather, they become quite monochromatic.
There's an interesting conflict, isn't there, between Muslim conservative social values on, say, LGBT matters and the liberal attitude towards immigration, which is that diversity is excellent, we want more Muslims in the United States, we should open the borders, and so on. How do you think that tension is kind of working out politically? Because we know that Muslims are going to be very important in a state like Michigan. How does this work in terms of the presidential election and so on?
Well, it looked as if the tensions on this were growing very high. And there were actual protests, very vehement protests in Dearborn, where Muslim parents were protesting against the gay agenda being put in public schools. And so it looked as if the long-standing alliance between the left and Islamic groups was breaking down. Then the Hamas invasion of Israel happened on October 7th, 2023. And after that, the situation completely changed. And now, of course, there is still tension between the left and Islamic groups, because for many of the Islamic groups, the dominant left, the establishment left that's in power, the Biden administration and so on, is not moving nearly fast enough to betray Israel and to end the U.S.-Israel alliance, which they want to happen right now or yesterday. And so now it seems as if the LGBT agenda has been completely forgotten for the moment, and the tensions over that in all their anger over Israel and Gaza.
Some would argue that Kamala Harris has attempted to appease some of these Muslim voters in Michigan, for example, by not choosing Josh Shapiro as her vice presidential nominee, who is Jewish. What do you make of this idea that the Democrats are trying to appease Muslim voters, and will it work?
Oh, I think you're quite right. It's obvious that they are, and it probably will work because they have nowhere else to go. It's not as if they're going to vote for Trump. They could stay home, and they might well do that. But otherwise, it's pretty clear that their only choice is to vote for Kamala Harris. And so they have all these concessions that she has made and that the Biden administration has made, giving $10 billion to Iran, which means that the U.S. government is in the peculiar position of funding both sides of the war in Gaza, and betraying Israel by delaying arms shipments that had already been agreed upon, by pressuring them for a ceasefire which would allow Hamas to survive when the Israeli government has repeatedly said it's going to fight on until Hamas is destroyed as an organization, and so on. It's likely that these things will indeed pacify the Muslim voters, and it possibly could, theoretically, could make the difference in the election, because it could swing Michigan and Minnesota into the Democrat column. On the other hand, you never know. This is a very strange election season, and it's impossible really to say anything about it with certainty.
Well, the emotive anger from Muslims in Dearborn and Hamtramck is real and visceral. I was there, as I said, a few months ago, and interviewed many, many locals, imams, Muslims who live there, and it seemed to me that they are just absolutely furious with the Biden administration. They think, there's a genocide going on in Israel, in Gaza, against Muslims, against their kind of brothers and sisters and their brethren, and the United States government, sent weapons to Israel, including Biden. So it seems that there's a real level of anger, and I don't know if you've seen this as well, but it seems that the emotions are very, very high amongst Muslim communities. What would you say to those who do say, there is a genocide going on, tens of thousands of innocent Gazan civilians are being murdered by the Israelis? How do you respond to that?
Well, what's the source? And then the source turns out to be the Gaza Ministry of Health. Who runs the Gaza Ministry of Health? Hamas. Does Hamas have an interest in exaggerating civilian casualties so as to curry favor with the international community and increase anger against Israel? Of course it does. There are two independent researchers, a British colonel, Richard Kemp, and John Spencer, who is no relation, who is a professor at West Point. And they have made independent surveys of the situation in Gaza, and both have determined that Israel is taking actually great pains to avoid civilian casualties and has a lower ratio of combatant casualties to civilians than even the Americans in Iraq and other military operations that have taken great pains to avoid civilian casualties in the past. And Spencer has even said that the Israeli actions in Gaza will be studied for generations to come in military academies, and he's of course a professor in one, as a way to avoid civilian casualties in urban warfare in high populated, densely populated areas. So really, objective observers don't agree that there's any genocide at all. This all comes from Hamas, and what is to the shame of the Biden administration, of certainly Keir Starmer's regime in London, and of the EU and the United Nations, is that they all credulously accept these Hamas figures at face value. Biden initially had said, well, we don't actually believe those figures because they come from Hamas. And then he was roundly denounced by the Muslim leaders in the United States, such as Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Nihad Awad of the Council on American Islamic Relations, and so on, and he backed off.
The only thing I pick up on there is you talked about Colonel Richard Kemp being independent. I've interviewed Richard Kemp. I think he's great guy, big fan of his, but he is pro-Israel. I think to say he's independent, I'm not quite sure.
Of course he's pro-Israel. But that doesn't mean he's not independent.
Right.
The question of independence doesn't necessarily mean that you support one side or the other. It could be that Richard Kemp supports Israel because of what he's seen on the ground in Gaza and his previous investigations of the actions of the IDF. The question of independence is based on, well, is he paid? Is he an employee of some organization that has a particular point of view that it wants to get out? Or if he found the evidence leading him in the other way, would he say so? And I think that's clear.
Do you think issues like Gaza will continue to dominate Western democracies, Western politics? In Britain, we've got 5 pro-Gaza independent MPs, 4 of whom I believe are Muslims. And in America, as you say, in Dearborn, in Michigan, and in Minnesota, it seems that this issue is dominating national politics in a way that it never has done before. Do you think this is going to continue? And why do you think Gaza as an issue specifically, has dominated American politics, British politics for the first time, whereas, the Uyghurs or something like that hasn't?
Well, it's interesting to note that although the Uyghur Muslims are being viciously and violently persecuted by the Chinese government, you don't hear anything about that from Islamic leaders. And yet you do hear a great deal about Gaza, where Muslims are not actually being persecuted and where there is no genocide and so on. So what is the difference? In the first place, it is the possibility of victory. The Muslim leaders know that leaders in the West like Starmer and Harris and Biden, they will give them what they want if they're pressured. And so they pressure them. But they know that they could bring any amount of pressure on the Chinese communists, and the Chinese communists will tell them to get lost. So in the first place, they know how to choose their battles. And they're not idiots. And why this dominates American politics and British politics is really the same answer from the other side of it, that the Western leaders are allowing it to, because they think the Muslim vote is very important and they want it. The Chinese, of course, they don't care about the Muslim vote. They don't vote. So they are not susceptible to the same kind of pressure. But as the Muslim populations have increased in Britain and to a lesser degree in the United States, the Muslim vote becomes very important. And even in the United States, it looks as if 2 swing states could depend on that. So that means they wield an importance far greater than their numbers.
Just again, picking you up on something you said. In Gaza, you said that Muslims weren't being persecuted. I can't remember the exact word you used. But isn't it the case that the Israelis have, there has been civilian deaths. The Israelis have argued that this is because Hamas are using civilians as basically human shields. But undoubtedly, there has been a lot of deaths of innocent Muslims in Gaza. So to say that they haven't been persecuted, or whatever the word you used, perhaps that's not quite right.
Oh, certainly right. It's 100% right. Muslims are not being persecuted in Gaza. For Muslims to be persecuted in Gaza, you would have to have the Israelis carrying out some specific operation to, say, demolish mosques as mosques because they are mosques, to arrest Muslim leaders because they are Muslim leaders. None of that kind of thing is happening. If mosques are hit, it's because Hamas is carrying out operations within it. This is part of the tremendous dishonesty of the Western establishment media, that you have the Western establishment media saying, oh, Israel blew up a school. Well, in the first place, it was summertime. School was not in session. And they don't mention that not only were there no students in the school, but Hamas was using the school as a command and control center. So, is that Israel targeting a school, or is it Israel targeting Hamas, which uses the school because it knows that it can use the attack for propaganda purposes, with the credulous and complicit establishment media amplifying their claims that Israel is targeting civilian areas? And this happens again and again and again and again and again. When you look at what Israel is trying to do, they are sending out leaflets and warning people with phone calls and knocking on the doors, telling people to get out of areas so that civilians will not be hit. And they are targeting Hamas-controlled areas, trying to kill or capture Hamas operatives. There is no targeting of civilians, much less of Muslims as such. And so I stand by the statement. Muslims are not being persecuted in Gaza.
Isn't it the case that the reason that Gaza has caused so much political outrage in the West from Muslims and some left-wing protesters and so on is because, unlike in China, the people who are persecuting or seen as persecuting Muslims are Jews? Isn't this an issue of Jews and, nothing else?
Well, yeah, I think that that's a great deal to do with it. That if you look, it's kind of ironic because there are still people today who will tell you the Jews control the media. And yet, when I look at the media, the New York Times, Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, Guardian, Independent, every last one of them, BBC, of course, foremost, they're all anti-Israel. And so I think if the Jews control the media, they're doing a very poor job of it. And what is really involved in this is that the media seems to be extraordinarily concerned with Gaza because of some animus toward Israel that may indeed be rooted in some deeper anti-Semitism. I don't know. But it's certainly true that you had, even on the basis of the Hamas figures, even if we take the Hamas casualty figures in Gaza as absolutely 100% accurate, which of course they are not. But even if we did, let's just take them for a minute and say, okay, 40,000 people have been killed in Gaza. That is a very small number compared to the number of civilians who were actually killed in Syria during the Syrian civil war by Assad's forces, by the Chinese as they have repressed the Muslim Uyghurs and so on, by the Nigerian various jihad groups, Boko Haram, the Fulanis, the ISWAP, the Islamic State West Africa province, in killing Christians in Nigeria over the last decade. And yet nobody says a word about that. What's the difference? Well, no Jews are involved in any of those conflicts.
But that doesn't make it okay, does it? I mean, if 40,000 or anywhere near that number of civilians have been killed in Gaza, that is unacceptable. I mean, that seems like a very high number of civilian casualties, when Israel should really be trying to be more, targeted in their approach to Hamas.
Yeah, it seems like a very high number. It's also fictional. And it's important to remember that not even one civilian casualty is acceptable. But when you have a military force that is demonstrably taking tremendous pains to avoid civilian casualties, and the only source for the claim that it is not being very judicious in its targets and is targeting civilians is a hostile enemy that has been shown to be dishonest on numerous occasions. And I saw this myself actually when I started to study the casualty figures from Hamas. That they would, that the UN for a long time, when the conflict began, was putting up the Hamas casualty figures every day as if they were fact, and they would revise them every day, and then it was broken down into three groups. It said the total casualties that Israel has killed, this 18,000 civilians as of this date, including 9,000 women and 4,000 children. And then the next day it would say Israel has killed 18,250 civilians, including 9,000 women and 5,000 children. And in other words, the total number went up 250, but the number of children went up 1,000. I saw this with my own eyes, and I documented this in an article I wrote at the time, that they were clearly, openly being dishonest with the figures, counting on the fact that most people would not go and compare and pay attention and track them from day to day.
Do you think that anti-Semitism is on the rise in the United States?
Oh, there's no doubt. It's quite obvious that anti-Semitism is on the rise in the United States today.
Is that driven by, what's that driven by in your belief? Is it sort of radical Muslims? Is it on the left? Where's it coming from? Or is it on the right? I mean, we've seen Nick Fuentes and others, be very anti-Semitic.
All of them. All of them are doing it. You see on campuses, of course, the left is joining with Islamic groups such as the Students for Justice in Palestine to carry out these protests with the encampments and so on, and increasingly openly expressing support for Hamas and Hezbollah and for the Jihad against Israel, even though these are still groups that are listed as terrorist groups by the U.S. State Department, as if that made a difference to them. This is something that is very clearly healing the divisions in the leftist Islamic alliance that had appeared because of the LGBT agenda, and leading to concerted action. Meanwhile, on the right, you do have these people such as Nick Fuentes and Jake Shields and various others on Twitter who are spreading increasingly open and virulent anti-Semitic propaganda, including praise of Hitler and repetition of actual National Socialist Nazi sources. And charges against the Jews. It's astonishing to see the things that we thought were relics of history being brought back as if this is now cutting-edge analysis.
We've talked a bit about the tensions between radical Muslims, more conservative Muslims, and the liberal left in terms of LGBT issues. Do you also see an alliance between Republicans and conservative Muslims over the same issues? So Michael Flynn, I believe, visited Dearborn and met with the mayor sometime in the last year. He's a prominent Republican figure. So is there this strange alliance between Republicans and some conservative Muslims?
I don't think there is much of one, but certainly this is something that some conservative figures have called for many years. Way back in 2007, Dinesh D'Souza, the prominent conservative filmmaker and commentator, wrote a book called The Enemy at Home, in which he argued that conservative Muslims were natural allies with conservative Americans. He and I tangled about this publicly. We debated at the Conservative Political Action Conference, CPAC, and on a couple of radio shows, as I recall. I thought it was a ridiculous thesis because a conservative Muslim, by definition, is somebody who takes seriously what the Quran teaches, which teaches that the unbelievers are the most vile of created beings, as it says in chapter 98, verse 6. And so it's hard to build an alliance with somebody who thinks so little of you. I think that it was born out of a naivete and ignorance regarding what Islam teaches, and it never really got off the ground. There's no large-scale alliance or movement of that kind even to this day, but there are still conservative politicians all over who make attempts at outreach to Islamic groups, not realizing what they're dealing with.
And just finally, on the issue of dawah, that is spreading Islam within the United States, Are Islamic preachers targeting blue states and red states? Are they going to places like Dallas and other kind of Republican heartlands to try and spread their word?
Oh, very much so, yes. There's a concerted effort actually to plant large mosques and Islamic communities in deeply rural areas. Many years ago, I spoke at East Tennessee State University in Johnson City, Tennessee. This is a very remote area. I met with some people in, I believe it was Nashville, and at the airport, flew into Nashville. We drove an hour into the wilderness to get to Johnson City. And then when we got to the event, it was 95% filled with people from the local mosque. And there actually, Tennessee is a particularly targeted state where there is a tremendous and rapidly growing Muslim presence all across the state. And there are other areas of rural America as well. It seems as if red states actually are particularly targeted in order to subvert the possibility of any resistance if conflict were to come.